Welcome everybody. My name is John Morgan. I'm the director of the Theatres Trust, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special webinar for our supporters, our corporate supporters, our friends, our patrons, and general theatre lovers. Thank you to those of you who are supporters of the Theatres Trust. We really appreciate your support. If you're not yet, I'm always optimistic about this. Do think about joining up and supporting. Yes, you can find information on our website. As you know, our role is to support the 1,100 or so theatres that there are across the UK, ranging from rooms above pubs through to Victorian palaces and indeed glorious mid-century thrust stage venues like the Sheffield Crucible. I'm going to introduce Ted George, who is the co-author of the Stirring Up Sheffield book, which talks about the amazing group of visionaries who came together to create the revolutionary space at the Crucible in Sheffield that we all know and love. After Ted has finished his talk, which will last about 45 minutes, there'll be a chance to ask some questions. So if you want to ask questions, use the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat function. So put your questions in there. Please say who you are, where you're from, if you're with an organization, just so we know who's asked the question. And I'll try to field the questions in a fair way as much as I can. Just a couple of practical technical things. Could you turn your video and microphones off? I think most of you got your microphones off and nearly all of you got your videos off, just so that we can focus on Ted for the talk. We are also recording the session, just so that you're aware, so that we can have this for our records. If you would like to see a transcript, subtitles during... Apologies, we're on a busy road here. If you would like to, I will mute myself once I finish talking. Then you can press the show captions button. Sometimes it's got a CC, which should be on the kind of menu bar of the Zoom call, and you can then select subtitles so you can see the text of what Ted is saying. If you've got any technical issues, again, use the chat function, but rather than sending the message to everybody, just send it to Theatres Trust host, and you can just tell them if you've got any technical issues and someone will try and get you sorted out. Good. Okay. That's all of my preamble stuff, and I'll hand over to Ted.
Thanks very much, John, and a huge thanks to Theatres Trust for this opportunity to come and give this talk today. Stirring Up Sheffield really is a passion project, and I just want to give you a little bit of a glimpse into this book, which was quite literally 50 years in the making. So Stirring Up Sheffield is very much a George family production. My father, Colin George, was the first artistic director of the Crucible. He wrote the first manuscript of it, assisted by his wife, Sue. And then after he died, I turned the manuscript into a book. I incorporated huge amounts of material from his archive. I also tracked down quite a few people who were alive during the making and who were able to fill in a lot of the story. And then my sister Lucy set up an imprint at Wordville to publish it. It has been a transformative process for all of us working on Stirring Up Sheffield. And I don't think I've ever worked on a project which is just so interesting, intriguing, exasperating, but also personal. The book is about the creation of the Crucible Theatre, but it also matches the creation of my family. My mother, Dorothy Vernon, met my father when they were in Sheffield. They got married and they had my two sisters and me during the design and building and opening of the Crucible. In fact, one of my claims to fame is I was christened on the Crucible stage back in August 1972, a theatre christening, pulled across the stage, which I think probably set me up for what I'm doing today, not as an actor, but as a storyteller. But I was very much a bit part in the Crucible story. I came along right at the end. And as a kid, I really didn't know much about the Crucible. I think this image that is often published of my dad in front of the Crucible Theatre kind of captures quite a bit of the ambivalence he had about the Crucible after he left it. And that's because of what happened then. That changed over time, but as a kid growing up, it took me a long time to really work out what the Crucible was, what it meant to my father and the people involved. And slowly the story started to come out. And it was an extraordinary story of inspiration from this amazing Tyrone Guthrie. Guthrie, as Dad always talked about him in quiet tones, the visionary who came up with the thrust stage and who inspired Sheffield. And then his long-term collaborator, Tanya Mazerevich, a genius, as my father often described her, who came up with the exact dimensions of the stage, who designed on the stage with Guthrie and with my father, and who was central to its whole design. It was an amazing story, a story about real belief, ambition, and vision to build this incredible new, totally different kind of theatre. But it was also a story of huge struggle, of huge amounts of trauma and anguish in the press, of a lot of anger, and at the heart of it, something unresolved, something that my father carried with him afterwards, which was never quite resolved in the end, right until, well, very recently, as I will get to. But our story anyway starts back in 1962. That is when my father came to Sheffield to become the assistant artistic director at the Sheffield Playhouse. By then, he was already quite experienced as an actor. He was a founding member of the Oxford and Cambridge Players, which went on to become the Elizabethan Theatre. He'd acted in rep at Coventry and Birmingham. He'd also directed at Nottingham Playhouse. And he'd already by this stage got a bit of a reputation for doing new or unusual kinds of work to try and challenge the audience. Sometimes it caused walkouts, other times it caused the young people to come in, but he was definitely brought into Sheffield to try and bring new life to the Playhouse. And as you can see from the photo, he was a handsome devil. Now, back then, the Sheffield Playhouse was well established and beloved of the Sheffield population. It was a converted temperance hall, which sat down on Townhead Street. It's no longer there, unfortunately. And it was, one of the most successful regional reps that there were in the country at the time. It had a steady, strong audience. This is a photograph from around 1962, who would come and see the show, which was in 2 weekly rep at the start, and then moved to 3 weekly rep after my father joined in the first season. But it was quite a conservative group. Some of them would cancel their tickets if there was ever a Shakespeare on or something by a writer they didn't like, something newfangled. And very often they would be in a bit of a cycle where they would go and see 1 week a show at the Playhouse, and the next week they would see the Halle Orchestra. But it was a very strong and supportive group of people who supported the Playhouse. And this was a great opportunity for my father to really change something there and make something of the Playhouse. So in early 1965, he took over as full artistic director. Jeff Voss, who had been artistic director, stayed on as well to direct productions. But it was at this point that really the Playhouse entered its radical, most productive years, the last years of its life, before it became quite literally the Crucible. And you can see here the full company from that first year, 1965. Dad is at the front crouching down. It was at this point that a whole series of careers were launched of very important actors who were important in Sheffield, but also beyond as well. One of the most important artistic collaborations Dad did, here we can see with Alan Cullen standing there in the middle and with Roderick Horn holding the guitar. They were to write a number of shows. I think Cullen maybe wrote more than 15 shows that Dad directed. And of course, a great singer. My mother, Dorothy Vernon, as well. They did quite a bit together. But also there was a new generation of actors coming up. We can see here like Myra Francis in the middle, on the right there as well, Barry Smith, who was a dear friend of my mum. And that really basically started a whole period of experimentation in the late 60s. We had the first Brecht, the Good Citizen of Szechuan, which of course is about to open again in the Crucible Theatre many years later. Angela Thorne is out there right in the top right, young up and coming actress. The first Pinter as well, The Birthday Party. We can see here with Wilfred Harrison, who was also assistant director at the Playhouse, playing one of the leads with Christopher Wilkinson and Rosemary Fowler. And you can imagine it caused a bit of a stir the first time Pinters were in there. But what was also equally important about what Dad did in those final years of the Playhouse was children's theatre. It was absolutely key to what he wanted to do to bring more people into the theatre. It started with a Saturday morning club, which was in coordination with Pegasus Theatre, which had been set up by my mother, Dorothy Vernon, who was a school teacher at the time. And it eventually evolved into Theatre Vanguard, a full theatre company for children, one of the first theatre in education teams in the country. And here's some pictures of what they were doing. That's Dad directing on the stage at the Playhouse in the early days. Then we have the van of Theatre Vanguard, and in the middle, the blonde there, that's Glenn Walford, who went on to run Theatre Vanguard, and many different actors came through there. I mean, Alan Armstrong was one of them, but also Robin Hirsch, as you can see there on the bottom left. He went on to set up the Cornelia Street Cafe in Manhattan, which was very important for up-and-coming artists, and of course my mum as well, playing guitar for the kids. She went on to join the Sheffield Playhouse. She became a leading member of the company, went on to a great and successful career on the West End stage. And of course, most importantly, married my dad as well. So if it weren't for children's theatre, I don't think Lucy or I would be here. But there was one production in that period in the late 60s which really caught the public's imagination. And that was The Stirrings in Sheffield on Saturday night by Alan Cullen. When it was proposed to do it as an idea, the board balked at it because essentially it's about trades unions, it's about the people trying to rise up about abuse. And honestly, they said, listen, this is going to empty the theatres. Well, it did quite the opposite. It was a rip-roaring success because, of course, it was a play about Sheffield. It was about their history. The music, Roderick Horn incorporated a lot of traditional Yorkshire songs in there as well. And it really was extraordinary. It was a sellout from the first night, or strictly speaking, I should say from the second night. I did say it was a sellout, and then someone after one of my talks came and said, I was there the first night. It wasn't a sellout. I was like, oh, I see. He said it was every night afterwards, though. And it certainly was. It really kind of captured the mood of the public and really put the Playhouse back on the map, if you like. And there were multiple productions and extensions of The Stirrings in Sheffield. That's, of course, what the book's title is a homage to. And so it was revived several times. This is my mum with Veronica Lang, the Australian actress, behind her in one of the revivals in 1968. But by that summer of 1966, you could say the Playhouse was riding high. So was the country, which just won the World Cup. But there was about to be an extraordinary change in its fortunes, which would basically lead to the birth of the Crucible. And it was in August 1966 that the entire Crucible board and company were invited to the town hall to find out what Dad thought was just going to be about some funding for costumes. But it was something quite different. Let me read what my father says in the book. We arrived at the town hall and were ushered into the main council chamber, a long room with a polished table and chairs either side. At one end, at what one might be described as a throne, sat a formidable northern lady. This was Alderman Grace Tebbet, former Lord Mayor of Sheffield and the first female leader of Sheffield City Council. We sat in front of her like naughty school children in front of the headmistress. She looked us over for a minute and then she dropped her bombshell. Now then, where do you want your new theatre? To those of us working at the Playhouse, it was a bolt from the blue. You probably want an island site, she continued forcefully, and with a wave of her hand, effortlessly destroyed Norfolk Street. Stunned as I was, my wits did not desert me completely, and I had enough adrenaline racing to reply that we really needed two theatres, a studio, as well as a large auditorium. I do love that story about my dad because when offered the most incredible opportunity in his life out of the blue, the first thing he said is, we need two. And that's become a bit of a motto for me and Lucy as we've gone through putting out Stirring Up Sheffield. It was an extraordinary moment. There were going to be a brand new theatre. The studio itself, well, it was an idea. I think if anything, it's the one thing that Dad really had an influence on the overall design. He was determined to have it, but it wasn't in the budget. They would have to deal with that one later, as you will see in the book. Anyway, a new theatre it was to be. And so a new trust was set up, the New Sheffield Theatres Trust, and two people on the board appointed there were going to prove critical. The first here on the left is Tony Hampton. He was chair of the Playhouse Trust and became chair of the New Sheffield Theatre Trust and eventually the Crucible Trust. He was a successful businessman. He was actually master cutler at the time that the new theatre was announced. And he was incredibly important in helping steer that whole side of funding and the politics and enabling the creatives to do what they do. The other person was his right-hand man, David Brayshaw. He was executive director on the board, and he also became the administrator of the Crucible Theatre. He was an absolutely fantastic ally to my dad. He was a close companion there. And these two together, I think, were really such important people in terms of making the Crucible a success, even though they're not often talked about, which is why both of them are, the book is dedicated to both of them. But what kind of theatre were they going to have? If we look at the Playhouse back then, it was a very decent proscenium theatre for the provinces, but you can see that it's a converted temperance hall. The seating isn't very great, the sightlines aren't good, there's a big gap between the actors, if you like, and the audience. And when it came to the public spaces, they were, you could say, hopelessly overcrowded as well. They needed something to be modern and different. Well, they argued and anguished over this whole thing about what should the stage design be. And then everything came to a head in November 1967, when the answer arrived in the shape of this remarkable man on the right, Sir Tyrone Guthrie. By then, he was already a master of the stage. He was known for highly successful productions of things like Shakespeare, but also of new works, musicals, opera as well. And he had reinvented, if you like, the thrust stage of the ancient Greek or even Elizabethan era, with the stage in the center and everyone sitting around it, the actor immersed in the audience, an intense actor-audience relationship. He was invited by Wilfred Bramble, there in the middle of the photograph, to come and give a talk at Sheffield. And when Dad spoke with him afterwards, Guthrie said, "So what kind of stages are you thinking of?" And Dad said, "Well, you know, all the stuff we've done with children's theatres made me realize we want to be in the middle. We never use the stage with children's theatre. We just sit everyone around us." And Guthrie said, "You need to see some stages in North America." And when Guthrie wanted something to happen, he could make it happen. And so about a month later, Dad was on a plane to the USA, along with David Brayshaw. And the first night they landed in Minneapolis and they went to the Guthrie Theatre. And that was Dad's Damascene moment. And let me just describe it as he does. And suddenly there it was, through a doorway at the end, the stage, gleaming polished wood, a narrow promontory jutting into space, inviting the actor to stand on it and ascend the brightest heaven of invention. I cannot describe my feelings without waxing lyrical. It was the tipping point for me, a phrase that in hindsight defines that moment a revolution suddenly catches fire or a battle is won or lost. He was quite overwhelmed by the stage itself. As you can see, it's incredibly raked, and it is designed by Tanya Mazevich, in fact, her third design of a thrust stage as well. It no longer exists, actually, this original auditorium. It's since been rebuilt in another location, but I'm told using exactly the same dimensions. Now, Dad and David saw a number of productions there, but the one that blew them away was The House of Atreus, which is an extraordinary collaboration between Tyrone Guthrie and Tanya Mazevich, his designer, using the thrust stage for what it was really designed for. All the actors in masks, which covered all of their face except just the mouth, spectacular costumes, amazing lighting, but relatively minimal props. And there was one moment in the production which stayed with my father. And in fact, Tanya sent him a card of this afterwards, where Orestes kneels before Athena and Apollo, and she looks down. And Dad actually said he was amazed that the eyes of Athena looked down on Orestes. He's like, how on earth did they achieve that? After the show, he asked Douglas Campbell, he said, "Oh, do you want to come have a look?" And when he looked at the mask, he realized the eyes were painted on. They couldn't move. He was so taken by the performance that he actually saw the eyes moving. And there was something about it which just was breathtaking in the production. I have his diaries from the time, and some of them are in the book, and it's really lovely the way he talks about it. The same with David Brayshaw. He's just like, "I'm so glad we saw this as our last production because I wouldn't have been able to understand anything afterwards." A few days later, they went up to Stratford-on-Tarry and they saw the original thrust stage, which had been built back in the early 1950s. Again, you can see a thrust stage, more of a permanent backdrop, but the audience wrapped around. They were convinced they wanted a thrust stage for Sheffield. And number two, they had to have the designer, Tanya Mazevich. And so when they got back to England, it was agreed to bring Tanya on board, and the Crucible could be said to have been born around December 1967. Dad met with Tanya Mazevich and her good friend Patrick Ide in a Pizza Hut in Cambridge Circus and started discussing this new theatre. Now, Patrick Ide went on to become very important in terms of the design of a studio and also of all the lobbies and public areas. He wanted a beautiful, amazing place that people wanted to come into. And anyone who knows that incredible sweeping entrance and outside the main doors at the Crucible just knows it was achieved. But Tanya was all about the design of the stage itself. And the stage would sit at the heart of the Crucible. And it does. Figuratively, spiritually, literally, architecturally, it is at the center. And it was her design which was going to drive everything about the building. Now, the book goes into huge detail about the design. I was very fortunate to connect with Nick Thompson, the original architect, who shared so much insights on the design process. But I just want to touch on a few things now, and you can delve more into it in the book. The first thing is that about the actual stage design itself, and I'm delighted to say that in the George Archive, we actually have the very first drawing that Tanya did. In January 1968, Dad went round to Tanya's flat in Chelsea. They started discussing the design, and she drew this first design of the thrust stage. And essentially, you have the thrust stage coming down at the corners, at angles. That's where the stairs go down into vomitories or tunnels under the audience, creating a separate entrance and exit for the actors. And then the size of the stage you can see there. And at the back of it, essentially, she's saying it's something which is convertible. It can change. What I find so amazing about this design is later in the Crucible archive, I found her stage plan for the first production that she designed at the Crucible 6 years later. And what's amazing is you can see the design is almost exactly the same. You have exactly the oblong coming down. You have at the side, the steps going down into the vomitories. And at the back, you have these movable towers called periactoi, which was her solution to the back of the stage. And of course, it's no surprise because she had designed many of these stages. She was bringing a lifetime of experience. And when it came to measurements, she was so precise. Everyone I know who's an architect or a practitioner of theatre always tells me that the interior space of the Crucible is perfect, and they can't explain necessarily why. The height of the ceiling is just right. But here's one piece of evidence I found for why this is. A telegram my father had kept. It's actually the day after her first meeting with the architects, where clearly they'd asked her for a couple of measurements. She had wired Stratford, Ontario, and she got back this message to the Playhouse, and it says, grade 24 degrees, height 75.5 inches, love, John. And Tanya's very helpfully written 6'3.5" to explain that. So what are these two measurements? Well, grade 24 degrees is the grade of the raking. And interestingly, the average rake of the Crucible is exactly 24 degrees. It runs from 20 to 28. Amazing that they settled on that average. And that height, that is the height of the exit through the vomitory, through the tunnel. And she calculated that as the height of an average man wearing a Roman helmet with a plume and carrying a spear. So she had precision in her designs and was quite extraordinary in the way that those measurements are perfect. And that is why the auditorium and everything around it works so well. But she was also working with a brilliant young architect, Nick Thompson. You can see there on the left, standing with his wife, Claire Ferraby, who he also worked with for many years. Nick was just 32 at the time when he became lead architect, and it was his open approach to addressing the theatre and Tanya's years of experience which just melded brilliantly together. He went on then with his wife to design and to refurbish more than 100 theatres and concert halls. And it's a fair bet that if you see any of you go to any of the theatres near the Theatres Trust headquarters, and you see a safety curtain come down during the interval, it's probably Claire who designed it. Anyway, so Nick worked very closely with Tanya. And one of the most interesting things about the design is this point that everything comes down to what they call the magic circle, that center of gravity in the middle of the thrust stage. Tanya said the center of gravity of the building is the eye line of the actor standing on the red spot, as Nick called it. And that's why it's on the front page of the full design, which was created towards the end of 1968. You can see there very clearly, the stage is in the middle. You have on the two corners going in, you have the exits to the vomitories. And the idea, Nick said, was like they dropped a pebble with the red dot. And as the ripples went out, that was the seating and the shape around it. It's very organic if you look at it as well. Steep raking as well required. But what about the actual vomitories? What were these? Well, essentially, they're a way of getting out underneath the audience. You may not realize it when you're seeing a production. It's only afterwards you realize how brilliant it is. If you go to someone like Chichester, unfortunately, they didn't have the budget or the technical capacity to build underground vomitories. And so when actors at Chichester leave the stage at the front, they actually go down the same exits that the audience do. And therefore, if there's someone coming up, from the toilet, they're going to bump into them. The difference with the Crucible is you go underneath, you go into a separate world. But how do you achieve that in terms of the design? And on top of that, where do the actors go? And so apparently it was Tanya who said, well, why don't we put them under the stage? And so after much discussion, the architects came up with, and the engineers came up with this brilliant design. And this is the original design. It's essentially a shell structure. And if you go to the Crucible, you will see the outside of the shell, you can see. But what's brilliant about the shell is because of its strength, what you can do is you can put outside walls, but you have a trellis roof on the top. And what that means is essentially you have no pillars anywhere in the center. There is an unobstructed view for absolutely everyone. This is a slice view, and the very middle is as if you're standing on the stage looking at those rows and red door. But you can see then that you have the vomitories coming off at the corner, they double back on each other, and underneath the stage is the understage area, which as far as I'm aware is pretty much unique in terms of being used very regularly by actors, although of course you do get traps in many theatres. So the design itself was absolutely brilliant in that sense, and it enabled them to actually fit in the seating, slotting it in almost like Lego, although we're talking megaton pieces of concrete Lego. Just to show you how important everything about the stage is to the design. I think this is why the design is so perfect. If you see, this is one of the architectural drawings from January 1970. In fact, one of the ground plans when they were starting to build it. You can see at the top, that little dot there, that is the red dot. And everything from there expands out. And all those different angles, the 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 135 degrees, are something that Nick played with, and they help with the whole flow of the building as well. But quite literally, you can see the stage is at the center of the building. And that is what is so important. How many theatres do we know where one of the last things they thought about is the practicality of the stage? With the Crucible, everything is about the stage, and everything built around it is to serve that space. Now, the other thing which might be of interest as well to you is to know where the big doors come from. These magnificent entry doors as you go from the foyer in through the casement into this magical world. And Nick wanted something which would really give you the sense of moving from the real to the unreal. And he thought of the tomb of Agamemnon in Mycenae. And so this is his first design of the doors, which open out. They're relatively similar nowadays, and this is how they looked on the opening night. Today, you just get one color, you don't get the whole thing above, but you do get that feeling if you've ever gone, you're going into another world. Well, that's taking it back to ancient Greek architecture. You can also see the magnificent carpet there, which is the original carpet designed by Claire Ferraby by actually putting two different carpets together. There is a legend that goes around the Crucible saying, we still have a piece of that carpet under the stage. So I got to see the piece of carpet, and I'm afraid it's actually not the original. It's from a refurbish in 1984, also by Claire. As far as I'm aware, there is only one piece of original carpet still existing, and it is in the possession of Nick Thompson and Claire Ferraby. And here is the proof. There is Claire in her kitchen, standing on the carpet, and my apologies to Claire for making her do that. But, you know, this is historical documentation. But there were many other people as well involved in the Crucible story. One extremely important, of course, is Richard Pilbrow, who has gone on to many great things ever since with theatre projects. Theatre projects were involved in a lot of the engineering and design, all of the lighting as well, bringing in some of the latest lighting technology of the time. This is a picture of him with his lighting desk in the Littleton a few years later. But it was particularly Richard's experience of working on open stages and at Chichester with the National Theatre and with Laurence Olivier. He came up with a way that you light the open stage. The basic idea is you need at least 4 different sources of light. The way he described it to me is he said you need to create the light that the actor breathes. And to do that, he came up with this innovative egg crate design. It looks like an egg crate. It enables you to put in lights wherever you want. You walk along the gantries at the top. A smaller version of this actually exists in the studio right next door. It's become standard for open stages and is really part of that radical, interesting modern design of the time, which really let the space of the thrust stage be used. By 1969, about September, I think it was, they were ready to go to the public, and they put on a big event. They gave out this brochure as well. They needed to raise money. This was the brand new theatre, which was going to be built in Tudor Square, which was pretty run down at the time. The Lyceum was closed. It was actually going derelict at the time. People weren't sure what's going to happen. This was all about regeneration. And the architects actually made an absolutely beautiful model of the theatre in Cherrywood. We don't know what happened to it. But unfortunately, right at this point is when everything went sour. Because now when they were ready to go to the public and show them what they were going to design, it kicked off a huge storm of opposition from multiple different sources. So if I just look at the biggest one by far, there were a lot of local opposition, but the big issue was what they called the Three Knights. Sir Laurence Olivier, John Clements, and how can I have forgotten his name? Sorry, Bernard Matthews. Sorry, Bernard Miles, Sir Bernard Miles. Essentially, the press recorded that all three of them did not like the thrust stage theatre, and they thought it was a bad idea. But you have to remember that if we go back to this period in time, we're talking 1969, there were much fewer celebrities. There were very few actors who were knights, so they had a huge amount of importance and significance. Now, in the case of Olivier, he was already heavily involved in the design of the National Theatre. You can see him there with Dennis Lasden, and that was a fraught project, to say the least. It started well before the Crucible. It didn't finish until the Crucible had been open for 5 years. He didn't like the open stage, it's clear. He wanted something different for the Olivier, but he didn't want to go in public and badmouth anyone, so he tried to step back from it. The same for Clements. But this wasn't the case for Sir Bernard. Sir Bernard took a personal dislike to the open stage. He liked a certain form of acting that he described as frontal acting. And he even sent to my father a very beautifully typed out excerpt from a book by a French actor called from the late 19th century, basically saying that you really have to have frontal acting if people are going to understand or people are going to appreciate your performance. He believed that the soul of the actor was in the eyes and the face. If you showed them your back, you would be disrespecting Baudelaire. So what was this kind of frontal acting that this actor had so demanded? Well, I found this postcard from 1901, Coquelin, that was his name. This apparently was the kind of acting that they were looking for at the time. Clearly, we're talking about different genres clashing here as well. But the problem was that Sir Bernard had credibility. He was the founder and artistic director of the Mermaid Theatre, which was, at least officially, an open theatre. Though if you look at the stage there, you can see it's really just more of a proscenium. Most people are still very much facing in. But it could potentially cause a lot of damage. And so this is what really stirred up the debate more than anything. Lots of theatre luminaries piled in to say that the open stage actually is something truly spectacular. Guthrie was the first to power in there. He actually went on radio saying this is complete blethers. He knocked apart the idea that all acting had to be just in the face. You know, because he was someone who was even older than Sir Bernard Miles, he really carried quite a bit of weight. But it was these two in particular, Peter Cheeseman and Michael Elliott, who were very well known for experimental and different kinds of theatre, who mobilized a whole series of writers to write to the Observer and actually defend the thrust stage. And so there's 2 whole chapters of the book dedicated to their letters. And it's really fascinating to see the different people involved. I mean, everyone from Alan Ayckbourn, Alan Plater, a whole mixture of very important writers from the time. But of course, that was the arguments in the press. Much more important was the building itself, and the architects pressed ahead despite the opposition. In early 1970, they broke ground and started to build the theatre. You can see it starting to take shape there. Temporary porter cabins at the front and the Victoria Hall behind. Gradually, the buildings appeared. You can see that's the studio theatre there. It really is a square with the corners cut off, but an echo of the design of the Crucible Auditorium standing just behind it there. Then in November 1970, the Crucible got a name. Up until then, it was just the New Sheffield Theatre. And so many names were offered, among them things like the White Elephant, which probably wasn't very kind. But in the end, it was the publicity officer, Hilary Young, who came up with the name The Crucible. And first of all, the Crucible, it goes back to the idea of a crucible where you make steel. Sheffield is the city of steel. But also the idea was it would be a crucible of ideas, and we're going to meld them all together on this incredible stage. Crucible, of course, also means an ordeal. And the ordeal was definitely about to happen for everyone involved. In January 1971, only about 9 months before it opened, Tyrone Guthrie visited Sheffield and went to see the auditorium under construction. You can see it there with one of the vomitories behind and the understage area. That's Guthrie on the left, in the middle, Tony Hampton, on the left, David Brayshaw. Dad was there that day as well. That's when the front cover of the book was taken. He's there. Behind is Frank Hatherley, who was the director of the Playhouse while Dad was handling the move over to the Crucible Theatre. It was an incredibly exciting time, and it must have been amazing for Guthrie as well, because he'd been working on open stages by that stage for nearly 30 years. To actually see this coming to life, a proper, perfectly designed open stage was very exciting. They were already in discussions how they were going to open the Crucible. Dad would open with Peer Gynt, and then Guthrie would bring his spellbinding production of The House of Atreus from North America to Sheffield, or so they thought. In the summer of 71, the roof finally went on. You can see this incredible trellis roof on the top, which means you don't have any pillars below. You have this wonderful open space. And then once that was in, they were able to put the incredible lighting rig, the egg crate in up above with the gantries. And you can see here the understage area and a vomitory there, and the metal grid on top upon which you can put your stage. And of course, you can also just put snooker tables there as well, though no one really thought of that at the time. Finally, by April 1971, it was time for the Playhouse to really, shutter its doors. Everyone was going to move to the Crucible. The final production, Britannia's Boys by Alan Cullen, Dad was literally at the end of the final dress rehearsal, and he saw that the stage manager was lurking nervously at the side. So the stage manager waited till everyone cleared, and as he walked up, Dad said, "Don't worry, I know, the wigs haven't arrived from London." And he's like, "No, I'm sorry." He said, "I heard on the radio this morning that Sir Tyrone Guthrie had died." The death of Guthrie was a real shock to everyone who was involved in the Crucible, and is one of those really, might have beens. There's no doubt that House of Atreus would have been extraordinary in the Crucible, but it was not to be. And his sudden death deprived my dad of his great mentor, the person who was going to help him through this opening season just before a brand new theatre opened. It was really a case of being thrown in at the deep end. But as Dad says in the book, he was surrounded by an incredible company. 73 people in total were in the company. That was more than double what they had at the Playhouse. They had a lot of actors who were highly experienced on the stages in Canada and in North America who would bring their expertise with them. They had Tanya Bazevich to help design as well, and they were going to make the most of this extraordinary opening. And so in November 1971, the theatre was finally ready to open. So there's a number of photographs I've got here. There's a lot of them in the book as well. This is how the original entrance would have looked back in 1971 with the red doors. It's since changed. These are the wonderful interiors, quite magnificent, with lighting by Tony Corbett. He did it on a shoestring budget. And you can see there actually on the right, on the stairwell, a remarkable design by my godfather, Desmond Healy, who was a theatre designer and architect. He did this amazing design of the Enchanter to open the new theatre. Where it is nowadays, we don't know, but one continues to look. And then just look at some of the interior design. It was fantastic. This was the downstairs bar, which sadly no longer exists. It's more or less where the ticket office is now, but the colors in there are just absolutely fantastic. And you can see the upstairs bar, which has also been redesigned as well. Truly spectacular for the time. If you think of what was available in Sheffield in 1971 and those amazing 1970s carpet, it really was a quite sumptuous experience. And then the auditorium itself, well, this is how it looked in 1971. And to tell the truth, it's changed relatively little since. You can see it's laid out, if you like, in Tanya's factory setting design. You have the thrust stage coming out, stairs going down to two vomitories, relatively bare and simple. At the back, you have what are called the periactoi, these movable scenery to try and create some kind of backdrop, but essentially everyone in the center. And since then, even during the refurbishment, there have been a few changes to the seating to take into account modern health and safety, accessibility, but generally nothing else has changed. The only thing I would say is the light bulbs up there are no longer light bulbs, they're LEDs, which makes it much easier to change them if one of them goes out. So to open the Crucible, Dad said, let's warm up the building first before we start with our first play. And so it was a night of mixed entertainment, fanfare it was called, in 3 parts. The first part, kids on stage. Kids are the future of theatre. Children's theatre was actually one of the inspirations for the open stage. And so there were a bunch of kids, and Dad improvised a show with them, the Aztecs versus the Conquistadors. It was a riotous occasion and really basically warmed up the audience. Then it was time for the serious drama, a performance of Swan Song, Chekhov's Swan Song, by the great up-and-coming actor at the time, Ian McKellen, along with Edward Petherbridge, his colleague from the National Theatre. Amazing to think that Ian was in his 30s at the time playing that, pretending to be an old man. He's now much older than the character he was playing 50 years ago. And of course, he wrote a beautiful foreword to the book as well. And then to finish, music hall and sketches. One of the coup de théâtres they did, they actually drove an old Austin 8 out of the vomitory onto the stage, just to show what you can do. I don't know if anyone's done that since, but how amazing for the first time, you suddenly see from underneath where you're sitting, a car emerges onto the stage, and then a whole series of musical numbers, finishing with Consider Yourself at Home, led by my mum there in the middle, Dorothy Vernon. Certainly, the Crucible had arrived. The opening season, they had to rejig because Guthrie was no longer around. Dad still opened with Peer Gynt, but there was also The Shoemaker's Holiday, directed by Douglas Campbell and starring him as well, and then finishing off with Treasure Island. And I'm glad to see that we have James Smith on this webinar, because he was in Peer Gynt and Treasure Island as well, has told me many great things about it. But unfortunately, no longer was the Crucible up and running, then the knives were out. There were many people who were unhappy that this kind of theatre had been built. Now they didn't like what it was putting on. And there were two people in particular, one councillor, Swain, a Conservative councillor, who complained that you could no longer do things like boxing, pantomime. Not true, they do that. He also didn't like the fact they couldn't do black and white minstrel anymore. I'm in agreement with that one, and it's amazing actually how a lot of tastes and have changed over the years in terms that wasn't a controversial comment. Alderman Ironmonger was much more thinking that a lot of the bill was pretentious. He said, why could you open with something like an Agatha Christie? Well, Dad's reaction was to open the 1972 season with his production of The Persians by Aeschylus. This was Guthrie's production of House of Atreus that never was. It's one of the great anti-war plays out there. It was all done in masks, all designed by Tanya Mazejevich. This is a central design. And from everything I've read about this production, it sounds like it was one of the most extraordinary things that anyone has ever been involved in. But sadly, it wasn't a hit with the Sheffield audience of 1972. And the timing couldn't have been worse, because in the summer of 72 is when the treasurer of the city had published a report calling for massive cuts at the Crucible. Now, the whole background to that and what happened there is all gone through in the book, but I still find it amazing myself looking back all these years later that a brand new theatre of the complexity and difficulty that it was managed to open 1 month after schedule. That's on a 3-year building schedule, under budget just, and yet they expected it to make a profit in its first year. I think nowadays, if you opened a new theatre, it was 10% over budget and you made a relatively small loss in the first year, you'd be cracking open the champagne. But they wanted cuts. And a huge battle ensued, which eventually spewed over into the press. All sorts of accusations and counter-accusations were made. Matters came to a head towards the end of 1972 when Alderman Ironmonger said there were too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And that really was a very clever turn of phrase. It really stuck, and it was repeated endlessly everywhere. But it really helped drive this narrative that somehow the Crucible was heavily overburdened, it was a pretentious endeavour, there needed to be cuts. It was clear that the Conservative tribe in Sheffield wanted a scalp, and unfortunately, that scalp was Tanya Mazejevich. Now, the problem was that Tanya Mazejevich wasn't actually head of design. This is often assumed, but head of design was Rodney Ford. Tanya was design consultant, or as Dad called her, Queen of Design. And that was actually her official title. I've got documents to prove it. He knew that she had designed this incredible theatre. He said, now you've designed it, stay, show us how we use it. And so the idea is that Tanya was there, she could actually design some productions, but she could share all of that knowledge she had with everyone in the team. And she was a very beloved member of the company. But cuts had to be made, and it was decided that the design consultant would be dispensed with. And really, for my father, that was the last straw. You can tell in the book, if you read, the difficulty he has writing about that particular time. And I really pressed him hard when he was writing it originally. I said, Dad, we really have to understand why you left. But I think the simple thing to say is that he had lost Guthrie only months before the theatre opened, the inspiration. To lose Tanya, she was the spirit of the Crucible, was just a blow too much to bear. And so a few months later, he announced his intention to design, April 1973. It took many people by surprise because it was around the time that actually the Stirrings in Sheffield was finally revived at the Crucible, and it was a sellout. Ironically, it had been designed by Tanya just before she left. But I think the thing with my father at the time, he just said, oh, I think it's time to move on. But everything that had happened with Tanya had made him determined it was time to go. The trouble was the theatre was in great financial trouble. There was no way he was leaving immediately. And so it was agreed he would stay until the end of 1974. And it was literally at this point that the fortunes changed at the theatre, Gradually, the number of people attending grew, the number of shows grew, the reviews got better as well. And by 1974, when he finally left the theatre had a 72% capacity, which is pretty good. And over 250,000 people had seen shows just in that season, something like 600 different shows done in the theatre, the main auditorium, in the studio, which of course was his inspiration, and also in the incredible foyers, the bars, etc. So when he left in 1974, I found these lovely things in his archive, including this really lovely certificate from the Crucible Club, giving him honorary life membership as well. Certainly on the surface, it was all sweetness and light, but there was something very unresolved about the way my father left the Crucible. And there was very much a feeling that he didn't feel he'd be given the recognition, or anyone who worked on it, for what they'd been through. And it was many years that he just didn't return to the Crucible. He might have been there for the odd event, might have seen the odd show, but there was no connection at all. And then finally, the logjam was broken back in 2010, thanks to this other visionary Welshman, Daniel Evans, who Dad met at the RSC and was going to be appointed as artistic director of the Crucible Theatre. And of course, Daniel is now co-artistic director of the RSC, so the circle continues. They were going to reopen the theatre after the refurbishment in 2010. Daniel invited Dad to give a talk on the Lyceum stage, talking about the Crucible, and that was the genesis for the book. And from there, Daniel persuaded Dad, said, why don't you have one last shot at acting on the stage? And so in 2011, Dad played Brabantio and Graziano in an amazing production of Othello. And in fact, it opened the production on the 20th of September 2011, which was his 82nd birthday. That was just a wonderful coincidence. This photo was taken on the day just before the first show. That really, more than anything, I think really helped heal many of the wounds that Dad felt for the Crucible, because the Crucible company and everyone there are just lovely. They made him feel absolutely at home there and loved. And I must say, all of us in the George family feel the love of the Crucible company and staff there as well. And it was while he was there, he started writing the book, and by 2012 had the first full manuscript. And then, unfortunately, he developed Alzheimer's. He was not unable to finish. And I said to him, Dad, I promise I will publish this to you as a book. It will be published, having no idea how I was going to achieve that, because there was just so much. There were dozens of boxes. There was so much information. There's so much of the story I simply didn't know or understand. And I thought, how am I ever going to have time to do this? And then along came the pandemic. And so this is me about, I think, 3 weeks into the first lockdown. I just threw myself in and realized I'm going to have to read absolutely everything and work out what happened. So that's about a quarter of the material that Dad had in his archive. But I also managed to contact many of the people who were alive at the time. I mentioned James Smith, but also Nick Thompson, many of the other designers as well, actors who were involved, and really managed to fill out the story. And then, as I said, my sister Lucy stepped in and set up an imprint at Wordville, and we were able to publish the book as I'd always dreamed it would be. And amazingly, we managed to, in time for the 50th anniversary, launch the book on the stage of the Crucible, in front of an audience of many people who'd been involved in it or were long-term theatre goers in Sheffield. It really was an incredibly special occasion. It felt like closing a circle after exactly 50 years, half a century. And as a little bit of a cherry on the top, the book went on to win the STR Theatre Book Prize 2022. So really wonderful recognition, which I think my dad would have been really proud of if he was still around. But there was one other thing, which was just a beautiful surprise that came from the book. And I'll be honest here, I can't say the book actually definitely caused this, but I think we were influential in this decision. Because the very day after I launched the book, I had a coffee with Rob Hastie, the artistic director, and he said, we've decided to rename the Studio Theatre. It needs a name. It can't just be called a studio. It's a proper theatre, 480 seats, and we're going to call it the Tanya Mazejevich Playhouse. And I think this is just such a wonderful end to the story. I think it's great that the studio now has a proper name. I think it's wonderful that it recognizes Tanya. It's one of the few theatres in the world which is named after a woman or a designer for that matter, but it also recalls the days of the Playhouse, the beloved Playhouse of the Sheffield people, which became part of the Crucible Theatre. And that opened under, the last season, it opened under the name of the Tanya Mazejevich Playhouse, and it continues to go strong. It's all a very long way from back in, 50 years ago when Dad and David Brayshaw sat there and looked at this extraordinary theatre coming out of the ground. They knew they were doing something radical. But I think one of the things I was really struck that what David wrote about when he came back from his first trip to North America and seen the thrust stage, and he's like, I do understand that we can't do things like Greek tragedy every month, but he's like, I absolutely believe that in the future, all audiences will see the open stage as a perfectly normal medium to experience theatre. Well, he was absolutely right. The Crucible sits at the heart of Sheffield, at the heart of Sheffield theatres. It's beloved by the population. Many of them may not even realize it's a thrust or what that means. The point is, it works. They were right, and I really do believe they've been vindicated over time. So what I just want to say before I stop and I just go to a few questions, one thing is just to say there's a free podcast series that I produced with the Crucible Theatre and Sheffield Hallam University to coincide with the book and the 50th anniversary. I spoke to leading directors, so people like Rob Hastie, but Daniel Evans, but also Michael Grandage, Josie Rourke. I talked to designers, amazing lighting designers, costume designers, actors, and in fact, the most recent, writers, of course, Chris Bush, who's magnificent Standing at the Sky's Edge, just won the Olivier for Best Musical, but also loads of actors as well. And the very last one, I'm glad to say, was with Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi. So if you want to watch those, they're free, or listen to them, they're free. Just type in Crucible at 50 podcast and on any of the channels, and you'll find them. And then one final thing to say is, if you do want to get a copy of Stirring Up Sheffield, there is so much more in there. A real rich story about theatre and fighting over it. If you want to get a copy, you can get it from Wordville. Just punch in wordville.net and you get a 15% discount. If you are a supporter of Theatres Trust, just put in that discount code, Theatres Trust, all as one word, and you'll get your discount. So I think, John, I'm ready to hand back to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Ted. That was, you packed, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more detail in the book, but you packed an awful lot of detail into 45 minutes. Absolutely stunning. Thank you so much. You know, both the kind of the design and how that fits into the kind of the broader sweep of theatrical practice and performance practice, but also that very personal story of your dad's journey with it, which has clearly become your personal story as well, or you know, always was from the day you were christened on the stage. So people do start putting questions in the chat if you want to ask any questions. I'm gonna take chair's privilege and ask you one to start with. So I mentioned that, you know, clearly it's been a personal mission of yours to get this story documented through publishing the book. And I wonder, and obviously your sister as well, Lucy, being involved in that too, what has it meant to you to do this project?
I tell you, it's just been amazing. I don't think I could have lived with myself if I hadn't managed to get the book published, and certainly also in terms of the 50th anniversary. I mean, I think there's just something about the way things come together, you know. It's like the fact that the pandemic was like a year and a half before the 50th anniversary meant it became possible as well. And so, but I think also this thing about, yeah, I mean, personally, to be able to finish a big project for my dad, for what I think is one of the most important things he did in his life, because he had a very big acting career. He ran several companies. He did found other theatres and other theatre companies as well. He wasn't a one-trick pony. But I think to be able to kind of resolve that whole issue, it's also just been endlessly fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much about theatre design. I've been set straight on many issues as well. But I think the thing which was lovely for me is at the end of it, to get to be able to present on the stage, I'd read so much about the Crucible and about so many different actors and the challenges and all these things to consider. I was obviously nervous. I thought, I can't go on here and screw this up. But when I actually went on stage, it was just incredibly easy because it's perfectly designed. And everyone says this, it feels like the palms of hands are holding you, you know, and nothing pushes you back. It invites you, but it doesn't invite you to fall. I naturally settled on exactly the right space, which fitted who was sitting in the audience without even realizing it. So perfect in design. That for me really completed a journey. But I'm also aware, I mean, it's only one part of the story we've managed to tell. They've had 50 years since as well.
Fantastic. That red spot comment made me think about a talk I heard Mark Rylance do. He said, whenever I go into a theatre, I look up at the ceiling to see whether there's a circle, because you want the audience to wrap around you. And he wasn't really talking about thrust particularly, but actually that's exactly what thrust stages do. I have got some comments and questions that I'm going to read. One's a comment actually from Kath Badham, nay Kath Booth, who was stage manager at the Crucible on the Othello production that your dad was in 2011. And apparently he told her the entire history of the Crucible over the duration of the production period. At one point they were standing on the red dot and he was telling everything about how everything sprang from that spot. Oh, you might want to know this. She also has a square of the refurbished 1984 carpet in her office.
Oh,
you might want to get in touch.
I would love to see a picture of that. I think that's wonderful. I'm so glad to know. Because also, by the way, I mean, I thought the stage management, they really looked after my dad, because dad was 82, you know, and he was so up for it. I mean, he really, really took the production seriously. But for example, one thing, I hope he wouldn't mind me revealing this, but one of the things he had to do was he went down the vomitory, and of course, those are really steep, right? And then had to very fast actually be at the back of the stage for another entry, right? They didn't want him running under the stage. So they actually had an ASM there with a wheelchair, and he would get down, sit down, then race into the other side. He'd get up and race up for the next entrance. So I thought that was beautiful. I thought they really looked after him. And I tell you, it was one of the wonderful experiences of my dad's life to do.
Yeah, brilliant working with
stage production.
Fantastic. Thank you. Another comment from Steve Nibbs. Fantastic talk, Ted. I was lucky enough to study in Sheffield and visit the theatre often. And Steve's question is, what do you think is the enduring influence of the Crucible design on modern theatre?
Well, it's a really interesting question, that one. And I must say, I've been asked it a number of times, and I'm afraid I'm still sitting on the fence. The thing is, no one has attempted to build another pure thrust stage, and certainly nothing a lot in terms of the ambition or the purity of this design. This is the last one of its kind, right? And that's strange. You'd wonder why. And I think, but at the same time, everything about theatre design has changed so much. You know, I think particularly think of the Bridge Theatre as a great example there. I mean, it's an open stage, it's a thrust stage, but it can easily be done as a courtyard theatre. It can be done as anything, you know. And if you talk about, for example, like the Donmar Warehouse, which is very popular among actors, but that's really, you do though have different levels there as well. So the thing is, I think what it did is it normalized the open stage. It normalized, you're going in and you're not seeing this beautiful proscenium with cherubs up top and your boxes at the side. It normalized the fact you go into a space and, oh, this is different, and the stage is what it's all about. But I don't think anyone has attempted to copy the design. And funny enough, when they brought Life of Pi to London, they took it to Wyndham's, they kind of tried to adapt that into a thrust stage, and I don't think it quite worked.
Brilliant, thank you. Do you have any more questions for Ted? Just having a little look in the comments. I've got one more for you. I just obviously you've spoken to a lot of people to create this book, including people involved originally and people now involved with the Crucible now. How have those different audiences responded to the book? What has been their kind of response to it?
Well, I think the great thing is first of all the people who were involved at the time, you know, so I mean, every time I've done any talk or anything, someone's come up and said, oh, I worked there for years, I did this, I was there, I saw that. So wonderful stuff. I mean, it's just so nice. And in fact, there was a lovely old lady who came along to the launch of the book, and she said, it was so lovely to hear the voice of Roderick Horn and Dorothy Vernon. I'm going to put on the record when I get home, you know. So there's a thing stretching right back to the 60s. And then there's people I've spoken to who said I was working there 4 or 5 years ago, you know, and I remember this period or whatever. Yes, that's been lovely. But I think what's really nice is just to see there's a real theme which runs through all the audiences. I meet people and everyone's always saying, I've been going to the Crucible for years. It's just for years, you know. Everyone has this incredibly long association, and the affection people had for the Playhouse, it's just the same for the Crucible.
I think that's what we find in our work, certainly, is that you know, whether it's a mid-century theatre or a Victorian theatre, the kind of personal affection and kind of the stories that people had to tell, you know, proposals, getting married, whatever, a whole bunch of stories about, you know, that theatre and what it means. Not just the stuff on stage, important though that is, but just what it means kind of to the community as well. We don't have any more questions coming through. So are there any final comments you want to make, Ted, or any thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, I think the main thing I say, the one simple thing I say is get the book and check it out as well, you know, because the thing is, it's really about it. It's a great theatrical story. And I think the thing I really liked about what we were able to do with the book in the end is we were able to explain how all the creative side met with the design side and translated into an incredible engineering result. And the way they're all tied together. Nick Thompson said this to me so many times. He said he's just never worked on a project where all of it was so perfectly linked together and realized. And so I think if you then read the book and understand that, and then you go into the Crucible again, you suddenly see the building in a completely different way, you know, but it just works perfectly on that sense. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, yeah, get and go and see a show at the Crucible when you can.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Toby. Really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us about your amazing book. And people, yeah, do go and get it. Use the 15% discount that you get as a Theatres Trust supporter.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as a Theatre Trust supporter, you get talks like this as well. We've done a few. I can see Mark Fox is on the call, who did a brilliant talk about pantomimes at Christmas. So yeah, we'll be doing more of these kinds of events for you. So yeah, do get in touch. But for now, thank you everyone for coming, and see you again next time.